Well, I really consider it a privilege just to be here with you right now. And my hope was that Laura and I were going to co-teach this, maybe another time, because she has a lot to say. And she's been with us on this journey for 9 years now. It's been an amazing journey. God's been teaching us a ton throughout this whole process. And I think that what I want to do is I want to share a little bit with you some of the journey that God has taken us through, some of the changes that He's done in our lives, and what the DNA that I feel like He's been pouring out upon us, and what I think He's saying for the future. And so I want to do a little bit of history giving with you, just looking at that. You know, when I was called into the ministry, I was 36 years old. Now, I think I was called when I was 18, but God did not want to release me on the church yet. I think He had some real major concerns, and so there was about 18 years of Him working on me. I was a teacher for a while. I worked as a field engineer for a while, and He basically said, "You don't have it yet, and I don't want to damage my church." So I think He put a little pause in there. But when I came into the pastoral ministry, something like the gathering was the furthest thing from my mind. I had no concept of it. I had no idea about it. I wouldn't have thought about doing it if you paid me. I love the conventional churches. South Hills Community Church in San Jose, and also for Santa Cruz Bible over here in Santa Cruz. Both of those, I love the people. I love so many of the things that we got to do. And so it's just, I had great experiences there. But I have to tell you a secret. Even from almost day one, once you guys are pastor behind the scenes and see how churches operate and what's happening, I always had the sense that something wasn't quite right. And I'm saying this not to be critical to the conventional church, because you could say the same thing about the gathering by the bay. There's still some things not quite right. And I think God is still taking us on this journey here. So I'm not saying that, because I also believe that it's going to take the whole church to reach the region God's calling us to reach. And that we're going to have to be in unity together and working with different types of churches, and that's going to be great. But I do believe that we have a particular role to play that maybe some other churches aren't able to do. And so when He called me and we began to go into the church, I began to see this sense of what I call a holy discontent. Not an arrogant discontent, not a one of judgmentalness. And so I'm putting that out there. But it was a holy discontent. There was something that I just felt like, this isn't quite the way it should be. And oftentimes what I find is that God often disturbs our thinking before we change our behavior. And so what He was doing right in the beginning, very soon after I became a pastor, He began to cause me to be disturbed about how some things were being done. I want to share with you just 4 as an example, and then we're going to kind of move on from there. One area just had the idea of looking at the attractional, being an attractional church as a philosophy. The attractional church. And the attractional church, the number one thing in the attractional church model is Sunday morning service. That 1 hour on Sunday morning that you are trying to attract people to come to be. And what you find is that behind the scenes, when you look at the hours and hours and hours that pastors and volunteers and the whole church spends in providing for that 1 hour on Sunday morning, I mean, it is a tremendous amount of manpower and effort and energy going into that 1 hour on Sunday morning, with the idea that that is what's going to have the biggest impact, the best return for investment. And what I would find is that when I was at Santa Cruz or even at San Jose, both times, there were times when I was being asked to preach, let's say, and I would find I would be spending 20 hours in studying, in prepping, in doing PowerPoint, in writing out outlines, in doing everything that you would, meeting with people, getting ready for the service. 20 hours in a given week, sometimes to preach one message, 45-minute, 35-minute message. And I just know that when that was happening, there were times I'd have this thought that ran through my mind, Jesus didn't do it this way.
Yeah.
And it was like, but I've got to do it this way. You know, I didn't have answers. I didn't have an answer. I just sense that I don't think Jesus would do it this way. But the philosophy of attraction, of inviting, was really based in earlier decades that the church had in our culture. Because in our culture for a while, Christianity in the church was a normal default for people. People would go visit churches. You could invite someone to a church and they would come. But in the time that we were doing it, we couldn't get anybody to invite people to church. Because most of the people didn't have non-believing friends to invite in the first place. And so it wasn't really working. And those who did come happened to walk in. The culture was so different to them, they just bounced off of it.
Yeah.
And so that whole idea of this attraction law, there was something about it I was thinking, it's not quite working. I don't know what to do differently, but it's not quite working. And then there was another thing that I saw, being on leadership teams and working with elder boards and things of that nature, what we were spending our time having to deal with. And what ended up happening is so often we were dealing with the 3 B's. The 3 B's: budget, buildings, and butts in the seat. I mean, those were the 3 most prominent things that we were dealing with. We spent hours. I mean, I would have a meeting from 7 to midnight over and over again. We would be meeting as elders and leaders of the church, trying to wrestle through those issues. And sometimes by the time you would drive home and you kind of felt all worn out, and you think, was that, I know it was important, but is that the best use of this group of people's time? I mean, there are some amazing leaders in that group. And I just thought, man, if there was a way that we could liberate that time and really focus on, either how to best shepherd the people in the church or how to best reach outside the church and minister to people outside the church. I mean, if we could have released our time for that, it just felt like it would be so much better, so much more. Another thing I found out is that a lot of times as churches, we're very church-focused and not as much kingdom-focused.
Yeah.
And the way that, and that was for me too. As a pastor, we were often evaluated about how we were doing ministry within the church. And so at one time I had this ministry, we called it Service Network, and the goal was to help identify your spiritual gifts, give you some training on your spiritual gifts, and then we developed all these different places within the church to release you to serve. But the whole focus was getting you to serve inside the church. And by the time we would sometimes work with people and we'd help them identify their gifts and everything, and then when we wanted to sign them up to serve someplace, they said, well, I'm already serving outside. I work in Young Life or do this or that, and they had all these places they were serving. And I look at my checklist and I go, well, it's not on the checklist. I guess it doesn't count. And it's just like, I didn't know what to do with people who were serving outside the church. Now, if you were serving outside the church in one of our ministries that we had going outside the church, then it would count. But if you're serving outside the church in some other ministry, I didn't know what to do with it. Because we were all about our church and not about the kingdom. And I knew that was wrong, and I was doing it too. I knew it was wrong. And so there were all these things just like were building inside of me, and that thought about Jesus wouldn't do it this way kept haunting me. And then finally, the lack of kingdom expansion was the breaking point for me. That was the breaking point. See, in 1975, Laura and I got married, we moved to San Jose. And when we came into town, I would say roughly, this is an estimate, probably the number of followers of Jesus were at about 10%. Fast forward 30 years, and I'm now at the end of leaving Santa Cruz Bible Church, thinking about doing another church, or where are you sending me, God? So 30 years later, and I'm looking at the number of believers in San Jose, Santa Cruz, the Monterey, the Peninsula, all this, 10%. In that 30-year time period, there was absolutely no advance in the number of followers of Jesus Christ in the greater Bay Areas. Now, you look at that, that was startling, discouraging, and And I had to think, wow, what have we been doing?
Yeah.
And yet I was participating in a lot of efforts to try to reach out to people that were very ineffective methods. And most of the time, it was come into our building. Come and see us. And here we are. And so, looking at that, I just knew in my heart, Lord, this is wrong. But I didn't have any answers. I didn't have any answers. And so, when Laura and I left Santa Cruz Bible Church, and I began to look for a new church plant, or either plant a church or go to an existing church. I was putting resumes out left and right. But what happened was, every time I would put a resume out, I'd look at a given church. Maybe we'd go to one in Yuma, one in New York, one all over the United States. We were looking at churches. And every time I would ask the Lord, what about this church? And I would hear nothing. There was like no response at all. There was nothing. If anything, there was like a little bit of a check. Definitely no yes. But what I was getting for about 6 months in my quiet times, just times of prayer, times of reading, what I was getting is the Lord was highlighting certain things. And the first thing he started highlighting to me was a passage about new wineskins. I mean, when I read that passage on new wineskins, it jumped off the page. It was like fire. And it was like it just burned. And I couldn't, it seems like I was reading that same passage like every other day. And I'm thinking, how come I keep running across this passage? But it was just like new wineskins, new wineskins, new wineskins. And I knew that God was saying it. So, I just began, as time went on, I was, in my quiet times, I would just be writing down. Anytime a passage was just on fire or was leaping off the page, I'd write on it, journal on it a little bit. And I remember one time finally going, God, I keep asking you about these churches. Here we are. I have no job. Laura's working full-time and with cancer. I'm doing all these part-time little things here and there, trying to help make ends meet. God, in that 6-month time period, not only helped us pay every bill, but by May, he had added $25,000 to our bank account. Just with money coming in. That's a whole different story. But as I kept asking God, what are we, where are we going? And I just felt like he said, hey, and I was complaining because I said, you're not answering me about these churches. And he basically said, I've been talking to you all the time. I want you to go back in your journal and look at everything that I've told you over the last several months. And so I had to go back into my journal and start reading. What had he been telling me? And in the back of your notes, where it talks about paradigms, were a lot of the things that he began to talk to me about. He began to talk to me about shifts and changes that were needed. And one of the things he kind of was sharing with me is that wineskins, there's the wine and the wineskins. Wineskins are not, the wine is not for the wineskins. Wineskins are for the wine. Wineskins are to hold the wine, protect the wine, place to serve the wine. And when they don't do their job, you need new wineskins. But the wineskins can change. And the thing that he was speaking to me about is that, you know what? One of the reasons it's not working, we've got the wrong wineskins. It's not allowing my wine to work. We need some new wineskins. The problem is, as the church, and this is including myself, a lot of the wineskins that I knew about, I believed was wine. And I didn't want to get rid of it. Kind of liked it. And God was basically saying, no, some of these things have to change. And I'm telling you, there were some sacred cows that I had, and still have, that he's going to say, no, that one might have to go. That one might have to go. If you want to see my kingdom go forward, if you want to see the work of the kingdom, then you've got to let go of some of these things because they're blocking my work to bring the kingdom of God to the area. And you have to be willing to let go of some of these things. And that has been a very hard journey, letting go of a lot of good things. But there were some paradigm shifts that he was basically saying had to happen. And I want to talk about just 3 of them tonight. The first one was this. It's a paradigm shift from kind of a static type church to what we call an apostolic pioneering movement. An apostolic pioneering movement. And it was interesting, before I even came to Santa Cruz Bible in 2003, it was in 2002, Laura and I visited the church. Never been there before in my life. We came to hear Chip preach, and he happened to be on vacation that day. So we get in but I remember standing in the lobby, and if you've ever seen their facilities are amazing. And I remember going into the lobby, and I'm just looking around as I'm walking, I'm going, oh my gosh, look at this place. And the thought came to me, I wonder what it would be like to work here. And immediately, because this is one of those few times, it happens very instrumental times in my life, that God speaks to me audibly in my head. And it was one of those times I said, wonder what it would be like to work here. Immediately, God said, I have not called you to build on another man's work. And I mean, I just I froze. And the first thing I thought is, God just spoke to me. And then the second thing I'm going, what does that mean, God? You have not called me to build on another man's work. Is that saying that I'm to church plant? You know, that was my first thought is, I think he's saying church planting. Now, Laura and I have been down that trail before and hit a wall 3 times. And so the idea of going back down that road again with Laura and maybe hitting the wall again was like, I'm not sure this is going to work out. Is that what you're saying? Well, the next day I've had my quiet time. God often does this to me. Sometimes he speaks to me most clearly. I had like 4 bookmarks going on in my Bible. And I'll go to a bookmark and there'll be a direct answer in my reading that day for the question I'm asking. And so I was asking, God, what does it mean when you say, I don't want you to build on another man's work? And I was in Romans 15. And I start reading Romans 15, verse 18. Paul speaking, he says, I'm not going to venture to speak about anything else except what Christ has accomplished through me in leading the Gentiles to obey God, but what I have said and done by the power of signs and miracles through the power of the Spirit. So from Jerusalem all the way around to Illyricum, I have fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ. It's always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known, so I would not be building on someone else's foundation.
Wow.
I read that verse and I chills. I have chills right now on my body. And I just felt like he says, that's what I mean. I'm sending you, I want to send you to places where the gospel is not being shared. New places, pioneering places. That's part of my call in your life. And I'm going, oh my gosh, God. And I remember I drove to work crazy with this. Because I started saying, this is what it means. And she goes, you're married to me. You know, what do you mean? I'm not hearing that. You're hearing that. I'm not hearing that. So we began this time of, it just felt like, okay, God, you're going to have to open the door here if we're ever going to do this. But that was 4 years before we ever started the gathering. The Lord had spoken to me. That is, Paul was describing his apostolic pioneering work of going around the world and planting new churches where there were no churches before. And that's what he was saying that he was called to do. And so I felt like the Lord was saying, that's a call in your life. But at the same time, he's called me that. But like many dreams, a lot of times when God gives you a dream, it dies first. You feel like he's called you to something, and then it just goes crash and boom. And that's what happened with this dream. So, felt like he called the church plant. Next thing I know, I'm getting this call from Santa Cruz Bible about coming and being executive pastor. I kept turning them down. No. You know, I'm not supposed to build on someone else's work. No. I kept getting this call. I kept going, no. Finally, they called one more time, and I said, I'll tell you what. I'm fasting and praying about a church plant I'm looking at doing it in Morgan Hill. So I'll add this to the list. I'll pray over these 20 days, and I'll let you know. doggone it, day 19, I hear the Lord say, I want you to go to Santa Cruz Bible and be their executive pastor. And I'm going, that makes no sense at all. You already told me not to build on anyone's work, now you want me to do this. I was in that building when you said, don't build on another man's work, and there I am now. How does that work, God? I don't know, I don't get it. But we went. We had no idea how God was actually going to use that as a launching pad to begin to do the work that he was calling us to do. But that was, didn't see that at the time. You remember Jesus, when he was in the upper room, he said to his disciples, as the Father has sent me, so I'm sending you. Apostolic work is being sent. It's the apostle is sent ones. One sent with a message. And so an apostolic work is being sent out, outside the walls of the church, going out, not attracting people to come in, but going out. Are there very many Star Trek fans here? I don't know if you have any Star Trek, some of you Star Trek fans. Remember the very beginning of every show, Captain Kirk you'd hear his voice and he would say this, space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before. Right? Do you know they took that from the Gathering Handbook? Seriously. That was in the Gathering Handbook. It was written a little differently. In the Gathering Handbook, it reads this way. Earth, our final frontier. These are the stories of the gathering. Its mission, to go into new territories, to reproduce new life and new Jesus communities, to boldly go where no man or woman has gone before. That's what's in the Gathering Handbook, right there. To go into new territories. It's an apostolic, pioneering, forerunner work. That's what God has called us to do. To go where places people haven't gone. It's trailblazing. When the earliest pioneers were in the East Coast, and they decided to go west across the nation. That's before they even know the Mississippi was there. They had no one had encountered from that group the Rocky Mountains. They didn't know how. All they knew was they were going west. They didn't know how to go across the river. There weren't necessarily trails for them to follow. How do you get across these mountains? That's pioneering work. Pioneering work says you're one of the first ones to go, and you have to kind of make your way as you go. You're not following a highway that's just in concrete poured out in front of you. But the call and the gathering was really clear. God was saying, it's an apostolic, pioneering, trailblazing work. That's what I want you to do. I am sending you out. I'm not asking you to try to attract people in. See, we don't have, our goal is not to grow big. Our goal, people ask me all the time, are you guys going to eventually get a building when you get big enough? It's like, no. That's not what we're about. We're not meeting in houses because we're just waiting to get a big building someplace. Because once you start doing the building thing, you become attractional. That's Valley. And they allow us to come and bring house church there every week. And they just give us an hour. So it's like, okay, we'll take an hour. And I just remember this one time we were there, and the guy sitting on my right, total, kind of never been to church before in his life, kind of atheist. We had to talk him into coming. So he was sitting there. Next to him was a nominal Russian Orthodox guy who's like, is this okay if I come? I'm Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. Yeah. Next to him was a believer. Next to him was a fallen pastor. We didn't know at the time, but fallen pastor. Then over here was a nominal Catholic. And we were studying the Gospel of John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. So we're working through this passage. And the Russian Orthodox guy was an engineering type mind, and he kept saying, how can he be with God and be God at the same time? I mean, so we're just having these great conversations about Jesus. And we finally get to that one spot in John where it says, he came to his own, but his own didn't receive him. But those who did receive him, who believed on his name, he gave the right to become children of God. And he stopped us right there. He goes, wait a minute. To those who receive him. How do you receive him? I mean, what does that look like? I don't get how you receive him. Would someone explain that to me? How do you receive Jesus? Okay, let's explain that to you. And we just had this great little discussion about what it is to put your faith and follow him and trust him and receive him. And at the end, we just say, well, does anybody here want to receive him? He goes, heck yes, why wouldn't you? And the Catholic guy goes, well, I have never done that, I'll do it. And we just had this amazing prayer time where they just kind of gave their lives to Christ. I mean, it's just like, it's so much fun. This moment, we get to do this every week. We fight over who gets to go this week. Because it's fun. But there's this pioneering going out to places, beach churches, recovery centers. You know, I love Glenn and Liz, the Fremont I was telling you about. They've just adopted these little league teams. And Liz goes and sits in the stands, and she just mentors and mothers these tattooed, young, 30-year-old mothers with kids and single parents and struggling here and there. And she's such a mother figure that she just comes alongside, and they just come right next to her, and she just speaks into their lives, and they do things together. And it's amazing to see, and that's where they go. They spend time there. They're going out into places no one else is doing that in that field. It's an empty field. It's an apostolic call. It's an apostolic mindset. That's what we have to do. We have to be sent ones who go. The other paradigm shift here is every believer as a minister in the church. We call that the priesthood of believers. And the thing about this notion is in the Protestant Reformation, there were three major ideas that they were trying to get across in the Protestant Reformation. The first was sola scriptura, the Bible only is our authority. The second was sola fide, which teaches justification by faith alone. But the third concept they had that they taught was the priesthood of all believers. But they never followed through. It never took place. It never got traction or mileage. And just the clergy, laity divide was still there. It was a failure, and I don't believe we're going to see our next major Reformation revival until that one is fully in place. Because we need every single person ministering in the gospel in one way, shape, or form, however God has wired you and called you, before we're going to see the movement of God in this area. One of our earliest mission statements was that we wanted to grow a movement of loving and worshiping communities where all God's people use all their gifts in all areas of service and leadership to build God's kingdom. All God's people, all their gifts. Not all churches necessarily do that. Sometimes what happens is you end up with a more hierarchical system. We're trying not to have that. We do have leaders. We do have people that lead and serve in different capacities, but we try not to be real hierarchical. I don't know if you've ever heard of the story of the spider and the starfish. If you cut off the head of a spider, it dies. Well, what if you cut off the head of a starfish? Where is the head of the starfish? So if you just chop it in half, you know what you end up with? 2 starfish. It's a decentralized system. And all the DNA is in all pieces. If you cut off one arm, it becomes a starfish. The DNA is there to reproduce fully. And for the early church, if you got all the apostles and put them in a room and killed them all, the church would still grow like wildfire. The goal is with the gathering. If Brandon and I died in a car accident and Bev crashed into us and took us out or something. Yeah, in the parking lot. It would go on. If it didn't go on, we didn't do it right. built it wrong. The goal is this thing would move because the Spirit of God, Jesus is the head. There's no other head, but He's the one true head.
Amen.
You see, I love that passage in Acts 4:13 when the religious leaders looked at Peter and John. It says they saw the courage of them. They realized they were unschooled, ordinary men. They were astonished, and then they took note. These men have been with Jesus. That's the qualification right there. These men or women have been with Jesus. I mean, that's if you want to be a leader, if you want to move and do what God's calling you to do, if you're with Him. We don't require seminary trained professional leaders in this movement. It's not necessary. Not everyone is necessarily meant to be a church planter. Paul tells us some plant and others water. God gives the growth. But our desire is to help everyone find the place that they're supposed to fit in. Some of you, God's called you actually to have more of an inward focus because your call is more to build and shepherd and care for those already in the flock. There are others that He's called to have much more of an outward focus, who are going out into the new territories, who are planting, who are starting new works, who are doing evangelism, etc. Both of those are good. Both of those are important. There's a natural tension that should exist in the church if both of them are doing right. We should respect and honor each other. The problem is most of the church today don't have the apostolic, the evangelistic, and the outgoing prophetic happening. That whole thing is not really honored in most of the conventional church. And so they're the ones that tend to take the gospel out and get it to new territories. So we're always looking to see how do we do that. The other thing, the other piece of the pie here is that supernatural power expressed in love. You know, it's a pioneering work where every member is a minister, and that supernatural power of God has to be released in all of its glory. You know, all of us are supported. One of the reasons why we could be happy that God has called me to be a minister is because He's also promised to empower you. You're not doing it out on your own. You know, one of my first experiences with some of the quote-unquote supernatural, now all gifts are supernatural, aren't they, really? You know, if you have the gift of mercy, that's a supernatural work right there, to be merciful at times when it's like, I don't sometimes have that gift, I don't know how you do that, you know. It's because of God, that's why. But when I remember a time, a buddy of mine, we would do deliverances sometimes together. And I just remember I was doing a deliverance in my office one time, and I was hitting this wall like crazy. God doesn't generally speak with me with great words of knowledge. You know, I get words of wisdom, words of knowledge not so much. So I'm working with this person, trying to find out what's the root. Where is this door here? I'm trying to figure out how to get to it. Finally, I'm frustrated. I've been an hour and a half with this person, so I call my buddy who's next door. Mark, would you come over here for a moment? So Mark comes on over. He opens the door. Before the door closes behind him, he says, I know what it is. I go, what do you mean you know what it is? He goes, no, God just told me. Well, what did He tell you? And he's walking towards the person. He told me this. Person nods their head. Yeah, that's it. I'm going, that's it? You got it just like that? I've been here an hour and a half. It was the supernatural power of God helped bring deliverance into this person's life like that. I mean, that's the kind of God we serve. He has that supernatural power. And that person, you know, just got a loving touch. I remember the first time my wife Laura, she always had some weird kind of ways of sometimes she would see things in her. I didn't know what that was. I remember when we went to Temple Nea, which was Jonathan Parviso's church over here in Capitola area, in between after we left Santa Cruz Bible Church. And we'd worship for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And then you would. And then afterwards, Jonathan would say, he'd look at the group and say, the Lord was speaking to people. I know He was speaking. So he'd go around the room. Did you get anything? Did you get anything? He'd just go around and ask people. Some people said they had stuff, some people didn't. He'd look at me. Did you get anything today? He'd go to my wife, Laura, Laura, did you get anything? She goes, well, I didn't get much. But for this person over here, and then she starts sharing this picture she had and the word she had for that person. That person breaks down crying and weeping. And then she goes, and then for you, and then she starts sharing what she got for that person. And then she'd have a third thing. And the 3 people are broken down crying in the room because God just ministered through a prophetic word from my wife. And I'm looking at her and I'm going, who is this woman? Because all the churches we had before then, that was not effective, ever practiced.
Wow.
Taught, experience. That wasn't, and I'm looking at it and I'm just thinking, whatever church we go to next has to let my wife use all her gifts.
Amen.
Has to let her use all her gifts.
That's what's up.
I mean, that was a commitment just right at that point in time. And she does. Hebrews 2 says this. This salvation, which was first announced by the Lord and confirmed to us by those who heard him, God also testified to it by signs and wonders and various miracles and gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. The salvation that was first announced by the Lord was confirmed and testified to by God, by gifts of the Spirit and signs and wonders. He desires to put his stamp of approval on the gospel message. And in the church, we have to just be able to operate. I don't forget one of the guys from the camp, and he's shared this story publicly, so I'm not telling on him or whatever, but Tyler came from the camp. And we started meeting on a weekly basis outside the camp. And as we were meeting, he had all these questions about Christianity. He wasn't a believer. He was a hardcore atheist inside, and he was starting to open up on the outside. And as we began to talk one day, I thought, you know what, I'm gonna show him Grant and Christina's because I want him to kind of go experience the fire service sometime. So we went over to their house, and we're talking, and Christina's there. And so while we're talking to Tyler and everything, all of a sudden Christina goes, "Is it your birthday?" And he goes, "Tomorrow's my birthday." She goes, "Well, I just kept hearing birthday." He goes, he looks at me, "Did you tell her my birthday was tomorrow?" "No, I didn't tell you. I've been with you the whole time. How could I have told her that?" He goes, "No, how did she know that?" I go, "Well, it's a gift. It's a spiritual gift, prophetic gift." And then she starts prophesying over him right there. And it's like every time she says a word, it's like going boom, 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 boom. And by the time we leave, he was so amazed. He goes, "I can't believe it." It's just like, this doesn't fit my paradigm, you know. It just didn't work for him. But what it did is it told him God knew him.
That's right.
Knew all about him and loved him. And the next week he gave his life to Christ. It was one of the parts that helped bring him to the Lord. It was a prophetic word, a supernatural work of God. God does amazing things that way. Amazing. I want to close with this. There's a cost to do what we're talking about. I know people in this room that because they've gone this direction, their families made them outcasts. I know people in this room that have suffered financially because they've gone this direction. I know there's a lot of cost for everyone that chooses at one point or another that says, this is the direction we're going to go. I know for Laura and I, back in 2006, when we were trying to finish out what we're going to do, it came down to 2 choices. Planting house churches, staying in the area, or there was a church in Napa that was offering me a teaching position. So the church in Napa had a salary, had a staff, had buildings, had a group of people already. It was a nice church. They believed in the gifts of the Spirit, all these things that were happening. It was like, oh, that's actually a pretty good fit. And they were willing to do church planting. Or staying in Santa Cruz without any people, without any money, without any buildings, without any staff, and just start from scratch, start small. And those were our choices. Those were the 2 doors. And God and Laura and I began to pray. We knew that they were going to offer us the position. And I said, Lord, before they offer us the position, and I have to say yes or no, I need to hear from you. And so it was a Saturday, Laura and I at night, we got down on the floor, we just prayed and we asked God to speak to us. And then we went our separate rooms just to pray and hear and listen independently. And when I went to my bookmark and I opened up my page, and I happened to be at Luke 9, which was Jesus sending out the 12 apostles. And I read that, and it was like the fire fell on that passage. And I just felt like God was saying, I'm sending you out 2 by 2 to all these different towns to start all these things. And when Laura came back in, I go, Laura, what did you hear? And she said, I have total peace for us to stay and plant churches. And I said, God spoke to me, we're supposed to stay and plant churches, but I was in utter terror and fear. And so I said, Lord, I need another confirmation. And so the next day, Sunday, he gave us a confirmation. I'll tell you what that was in a moment. And I still was in utter terror and fear. I said, God, one more, please. And so Monday, we were praying, and then we went our separate ways to listen and pray for a while. And my next chapter happened to be Luke 10. Luke 10, Jesus sends out the 72. And as soon as I read that, I hear God say, I'm telling you the same thing again. Yes, you're supposed to go 2 by 2 and plant churches. And then I saw the word pioneering. And I heard San Jose, Santa Cruz, Monterey. So it was regional. It was regional. And that we were to go. And so while we were praying and said, okay, we're going to go, while we were sitting in the living room praying, Napa called to offer the job at that time. And I told him no. But the second confirmation was after that Saturday night when Laura and I heard the Lord say, you're supposed to go. Laura came to me and she said, I think we're supposed to drive a stake in the ground. It says, we're not leaving, we're doing this. I go, what are you thinking? She said, I think we're supposed to buy our burial plots. And say, we're going to be buried here. Wow. And we knew that it would take about $3,000 or so. And when she said that, I just had this total peace. So I go, okay, let's do it. So the next day I was doing interim preaching in San Jose. And at the end of the service, a friend I hadn't seen for a few years came up, gave me a hug, said hi, gave me an envelope. It was a check for $3,000. God was basically saying, I'm buying your burial plots. And so we did. We bought 2 burial plots in Pacific Grove with an ocean view. And I have to tell you, there are times that I wanted to quit. I know there are times Laura wanted to quit. I know every leader in the gathering, there's times that they wanted to quit. Came probably very close to quit. It has been a hard road. It hasn't been easy by any stretch of the imagination. And I think if we really are serious about seeing God do a work that spreads from here up the peninsula, Salinas, Monterey, San Jose, we're not just talking about a few house churches here and there. We're talking about many networks of house churches. We want to see literally hundreds of networks. Each network, 10, 15 house churches. We want to see it as wildfire. We don't want to see it, it's not under my control, anyone's control. These are independent networks that are independent of each other financially, leadership. that God calls each one of them and say, this is the niche I have for you. This is the niche I have for you. And they're out there doing it. And we do things together because we're friends and we have a common vision, but not because of any hierarchy. There's this ability just to release people and to go and to do that. That's our heart. That's our desire. We want to build right. We want to build with the right DNA that others can take that DNA and be successful. And they can learn from us and the mistakes we've made. And hopefully we get rid of our old white skins enough that they don't pull us back. And to me, this is a holy call. It's a holy work. I think it came straight from the heart of God. I think God wants to see his church rise up, reach out, and really be transforming this region for the kingdom of God. Laura and I are committed to it till the day we die. Firmly believe we'll all be buried there. God promised us a long time ago, prophetic word, that he was raising up a band of brothers and sisters to do this work. That we wouldn't be doing this alone. That there were others that had a passion and a heart who were committed, who would say, man, I'll go do that. I'll do that too. And that's what we're looking for. That's what we continue to see. God has brought many people who have made huge commitments to do this. And we are just honored, we're privileged, we're humbled by that. We're humbled by that. What I want to do is this right now. I want to ask you to stand. I'm just going to ask right now. I'm not asking you to commit yourself to the gathering. I'm asking you to commit yourself to do an apostolic work, to bring the kingdom of God to this region. Willingness to lay aside any wineskin that doesn't fit. To see God raise up that we would be able to say in the future, it's not 10% here anymore. It's not even 11%. It's not 12. About 30, 40, 50, 60%. What is wrong with that? We need to see a movement happen in this region. So let's pray. Father, we just declare right now, yes. Lord, your heart is so much bigger than ours. But we want to say yes to your heart.